Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson, Michael Grumbine, and Dan Coates.
Wow. That was awesome. Did you guys see that new intro? Oh, sorry, all you people who are just listeners. So lame. We have this awesome new intro that Francesco helped me with. Just a listener who was like, hey guys, the intro that you put on, I can do better than that. And I said, please help me. You can do better because I'm not a pro at this. But yeah, huge thanks to Francesco. Oh, so much better. It looks like we have professionals working for us.
We will swiftly disabuse our listeners of that notion in this episode.
Right. So Francesco, I'm going to link to his YouTube channel below, where he uploads his VFX. He's a VFX guy. He works at an agency and does actual videos. So he's a listener who loved it, and he's like, hey, guys, so it's hurting my eyes to see your intro every single time because he noticed all the wrong details with it. So huge shout out to Francesco for that. That was awesome.
I have two favorite parts of the new intro.
Yeah.
And this is especially important for those of you that aren't even watching. No. So he adds the old maps, Tolkien maps.
Yes.
And he does a cool angle on the second one. That's pretty awesome. Yeah. But I love most of all from a thematic perspective that he ends with the ocean. And I think Tolkien would approve. So the ocean is our background now for the ending shot in the intro. So
yes.
Very cool.
Yeah. I'm just surprised we don't see Galadriel swimming across in the middle of the ocean, with little legs kicking by as we go. No, I'm
not
joking.
Too late.
So I got that
in.
We could have a cut.
Can we do that?
Yeah, and we'll do it for our Twerk Inquisition. We'll have that intro.
That would be so good. No, I can't put more work on him. Anyway, guys, thanks for joining us. Hey, this is our 5th time through on Fairy Stories, and last week Michael made the point that try and find anybody who has done on Fairy Stories. Hey, I found somebody, but they didn't go through it over 5 separate episodes, which might turn into 6. So you're getting a master's class here on Fairy Stories, and so am I, because Michael knows the stuff, and the discussions we're having are it's bringing it to life for me more than it ever has in the past. And I've read it a few times before, but this is truly special.
Same with me. You get so much more out of discussions rather than just reading it. Just because I've read it a bunch of times doesn't. Yeah. You just get so much more when you talk about it.
Right. But I will say, this long period of time has taken us to finish on Fairy Stories. We're going to need a certain amount of recovery after we escape the shackles of this, so that we can be consoled by those around us. Huh?
It's a joke. Good joke. Good joke.
So this chapter is called Recovery, Escape, and Consolation. And we're going to jump into it. But of course, before we do, guys, we have to let you know that you got to become a supporter. You got to become a member to get the extended podcast. Go to theonering.com/member. Join us there. Join our Discord chats. Ask your questions. This week, we're going to be talking about modern art, contemporary art, whatever you want to call it. Art that sucks. What we're going to be talking about, is recovery, escape, consolation, is that a part of that modern art? Can we say that there's some does that play any part in art outside of the fairy story and how it's changed, even how fairy stories have changed over the last 60 years? So we'll talk about that. We got a quote from Siguenza, who apparently in my notes here, I totally lost it all. I undid it all or something. I don't know where it is. There it is. And his comments and thoughts on last week's episode about fantasy. And so I'd read it, but then that would kind of make the whole members block moot. So I'm not going to read the quote, but we're going to talk about his thoughts on fantasy as they pertain to even Turin Turinbar again, because I think that's an important thing. I love this story, but it doesn't feel like it has recovery, escape, consolation necessarily, but it's something we'll dive into. So join us there, theonering.com/member, or members. If you like plural, you can do that too. They both work. It's amazing what you can do with the internet. So join us there. All right, guys, we are on. But here, first of all, good dude, you guys are together, Natalie, Kim. What's going on?
You're here.
So Natalie, Kim. So those of you who are watching and may be confused about our names, you need to read the last chapter, the chapter we're talking about, because then you will understand. And you may or may not get a clue during this episode. Right. But I would like to point out that what Jonathan says at the beginning of every episode is absolutely true. We need subscribers. So when we don't have enough subscribers, then we lose one of our windows, and Michael is forced to join Dan, and now we only have 2. We're down to 2 windows, people. We need more.
The costs of the extra screens on StreamYard are getting more and more expensive every year. It's Bidenomics and streaming. No, but Michael and Dan are together in California.
We are
in the same place.
Yeah,
I'll it out.
It's pretty awesome.
I'm glad he thinks so, because I do too.
Guys. No, it's awesome to see you guys together. It's like we're 2/3 of the way there of getting all 3 of us together for a podcast. At some point, we can just get our schedules to line up and
are we allowed to smoke cigars on podcasts, or is that against the rules?
I don't care. Go ahead.
No, I mean not tonight. I mean, when we get a trifecta of us all in one place.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. I'll do that in a good Belgian beer. I'll be very happy then. Yes. Okay, let's jump into this, guys. We've spent way too long on this intro. But
this last chapter is pretty cool. Lots of Chesterton. He starts and he obsesses over trees. Lots of Chesterton. He takes down sci-fi. He attacks electric lights, and he finishes with the gospel. So it's pretty cool. Just saying.
Well, he starts with recovery, so why don't we start there, since there's
there's
other things.
Recovery.
So, recovery, and this one, I will say I was a little almost, I guess, confused by the idea of recovery, and man, we can go into such detail on this, but maybe here's a place to start with the question that I'd have for you guys, as Tolkien talks about. Define recovery for me. Like, what does he mean by recovery? What are we recovering from? I guess is the best way, because it's there, but am I missing the definition of the recovery from what, or the recovery toward what?
Well, you can. I think you can figure it out from the definition that he gives. It takes him a few paragraphs to get there, but he does give a definition. He says recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view. So, clear view of what? Seeing things as they are. So it's a regaining of a clear view of the world itself, of life around us, and that implies that our regular existence has a character through which our vision gets blurred. We get not clear vision. Maybe we see through a glass darkly, right? So there's the reality of living in reality. So there's a thing that happens with us where we get kind of tired of the familiar, and we cease to see reality with the wonder and the thing which it deserves. Reality deserves to be marveled at, and we stop seeing that, or our vision becomes blurry. And so recovery is that ability to clear the vision and see reality for what it truly is, worthy of our admiration, worthy of our wonder, etc. Very Chestertonian, actually.
Yeah. Okay. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add on, like, we forget, and I think that as people, and it's our nature, at least as fallen human beings, it seems like it's in our nature to forget. And like, I think he uses the example of like colors and of seeing green for the first time and being astounded by it. He says we should look at green again and be startled anew by blue and yellow and red. And he says we should meet, all these different creatures that you could meet in fantasy, and then suddenly behold. So it's like, it's as if you're seeing it for the first time. Mm-hmm. And I think what Michael was saying is that familiarity, like we just get used to things. We take things for granted. And I think we do this in our lives too. We like just going about our lives. We just go to work every day. We clock in, we clock out. We see our family every day. Mm-hmm. And I think like it becomes so routine that it's always going to be there. We expect it's always there. And then we forget the preciousness of all those things.
Recovery is a weird word for that for me, I guess.
Recovery? Well, it implies
something.
In recovery of sight is what it is.
Yeah,
so it's returning to the way we should be looking at things. Interestingly enough, not perhaps surprisingly, but in an interesting twist, he references, to build on what Dan said, he references what we do with that familiar thing by pointing out that it becomes familiar to us because we loved it once, because it had beauty once, and we brought it to ourselves. So he says about those things that are the things that we have to recover our sight about in the world. He says, they have become like the things which once attracted us by their glitter or their color or their shape, and we laid hands on them and then locked them in our hoard, acquired them, and acquiring ceased to look at them. So we reached out for the things that we desired, that were beautiful to us, that were worthy of holding to ourselves. Our family is a good example. And then after a time, after bringing them to ourselves and hoarding them, we cease to look at them. And so we cease to see them for what they are.
I think this part of the chapter is missing that good old real life example that I need in order to get a better glimpse. So let me give an example, right? So, and I have a quote from Chesterton. I think that clarifies it for me, because like when you mentioned Chesterton, like I thought of a quote from Orthodoxy that I brought up. But in the same sense that if you were on vacation all the time, right, you're not on vacation anymore. You don't enjoy it as a separation from your normal life. It just becomes normal life. And that's essentially, in a real sense, what he's saying is, like, if the spectacular sunset and you see it every night, you've lost the ability to actually revere that sunset, because it's just normal and everyday. It is the life that you lead, and it has, and so to regain that, to see that every day anew is something special if you can regain that. Does that make sense?
Right. And
maybe
there's a way of regaining it. So he says, and he actually brings up Chesterton directly here.
Yeah.
And I'm going to let Dan say the word, because I want to hear Dan say the word that he brings up.
So I felt really dumb when I was talking to Michael before recording this, because I'm like, hey, it's that thing that Chesterton talked about where he uses the word like Mooreeffoc or something like that. Yeah, I got to be very careful how you say that, I guess. Mooreeffoc. And he's like, you know what that is, right? And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, I get what he's saying, but he's like, no, it's Coffeeroom backwards. And it's this idea of taking something that's very common and everyday, just trite, and looking at it from a different angle. And now it's you kind of see it anew for what it is. Yeah. And I thought that was really interesting. And he goes on that same line of thought where he's talking about Pegasus, like in the making of Pegasus, horses were ennobled. So like for people back in the day, probably a horse was just an everyday sight. Like, oh, Bill's got a horse and Michael's got a horse and Jonathan's got a horse. Everyone's got horses, whatever. But like this idea of in fantasy, you have the Pegasus of something that's just swift and beautiful, and it makes you remember or see again for the first time. Oh yeah, horses are really cool. Like, I don't know. I thought that was really a really neat way of putting that.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because first he tackles Chesterton, right? He says, in order to see the world anew, in other words, in order to get recovery, you don't actually need fantasy necessarily. You can just have humility, the way Chesterton talks. And so then he brings up Chesterton and the Mooreeffoc. I mean that's what it is. Look, that's what the word is. But he then says, but in addition to just having humility, sometimes that's not enough, because at the end of the day, with humility and in the ability to come and look at a thing like a coffee room with new eyes to make it a new thing, ultimately he says that is not actually. Let me see if I can find it. But it has, I think, this is the ability to see things with a new light. I think only a limited power. For the reason that recovery of freshness of vision, by the way, there's your definition again, Jonathan. Recovery is freshness of vision. Mm-hmm. For the reason that recovery of freshness of vision is its only virtue. The word that I just said may cause you suddenly to realize that England is an utterly alien land, lost either in some remote past age glimpsed by history, or in some strange dim future to be reached only by time machine, to see the amazing oddity and interest of its inhabitants and their customs and feeding habits. But it cannot do more than that. Okay, so he's saying that fantasy goes on then on to in the next sentence to say basically creative fantasy does something new. So let's go to the Pegasus that Jonathan just talked about.
Dan just talked about, but sure.
Oh, I mean, sorry, Dan just talked about, or NAD, as we're calling ourselves today. Sorry about that. So what Dan just said was that, or quoted from Tolkien, was that by the making of Pegasus, horses were ennobled. Well, what's the making of Pegasus? Pegasus isn't just a story about a noble horse. He isn't just Shadowfax, for example, who's a horse that can stand in front of the Witch King. Pegasus is a horse who has wings. In other words,
fly.
We've taken a horse and we've added the power of flight to the horse and the physical attributes that are required for flight. And we ennoble horses by creative fantasy. So that's the creative fantasy. The Pegasus is a creative endeavor in the world of narrative storytelling. Interestingly, he says, in the trees of the sun and moon, root and stalk, flower and fruit are manifested in glory. One can't help but, of course, think, even though Tolkien hasn't written it yet, or he may have written the beginnings of it, but he hasn't even, there's been no publishing. We have the two trees in the Silmarillion. Mm-hmm. He's actually going to have two trees which shine like the sun and moon. They aren't going to be of the sun and moon, but the sun and moon are going to come from them in his new world. And so it's interesting how he has for him, there are certain concepts like this, like the trees of the sun and the moon, which are so powerful that he needs to incorporate them even into his own work. But you're ennobling trees. You're making trees a better thing by having the trees of the sun and moon.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. So, and this goes back again to the green sun idea that he mentioned two sections back, where it is magic. It is a magic of sorts. It is the
magic of the adjective.
It is true subcreation to give wings to a horse, because nothing else can do that and create it so vividly inside your own mind. Otherwise, it just becomes, a false representation of what it is, either on paper or on a screen or in a dramatic play.
But, and I would point out that in order for it to ennoble horses, it was also necessary for a story to be told about a winged horse. So you have the winged horse that is then, captured by Perseus and used in Greek mythology. So the story is part of which is of course fantasy. That's part of the magic.
Let me bring up this quote from Chesterton and see, like this. I read this here as we were talking to, so I apologize if I missed anything, because I was trying to multitask in my head, and that's really dangerous for men to do. So this is from.
He wasn't listening to you, is what he said.
I mean, that's the normal. I presume that no one listens.
I have a lot of practice doing that. Yeah. So this is from Orthodoxy. Chesterton wrote, "When we are very young children, we do not need fairy tales. We only need tales," which is interesting. Even then, he's pointing out, right, the tales are fairy enough for us at that point. Mere life is interesting enough. A child of 7 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door and saw a dragon, but a child of 3 is excited by being told that Tommy opened the door. Boys like romantic tales, but babies like realistic tales because they find them romantic. This proves that even nursery tales only echo an almost prenatal leap of interest and amazement. These tales say that apples were golden only to refresh the forgotten moment when we found out that they were green. They make rivers run with wine only to make us remember for one wild moment that they run with water.
That's cool.
I like that. It's very
except that apparently his primal apple was green and not red. That's very interesting.
Well, red delicious or not delicious. So
I'm not talking about the variety. I agree with that. But the classic apple is red. It is the color of blood and rubies, especially from the Greeks anyway. So
yeah, that kind of touches on on what Tolkien says in this chapter, or this portion, where he says all actual fairy story are largely about simple or fundamental things, but the simplicities are made more luminous by their setting. I thought that was a really interesting phrase, because when it
Yeah.
comes down to it, it's just very, very simple. Like you were talking about with Chesterton, like we forget that apples are something wonderful. We forget rivers running with water. That's a wondrous thing, and we forget that.
And it's interesting how when I go on vacation, I love going to the beach or to a running river. And one of the things I love the most is may sound a little odd, but I like to sleep next to them and like take a nap, for example. I'll take a book out. I'll take a book out by the river or on the ocean, and I'll read and then I'll nap. The moment of waking up and looking across the water, especially if the sun is on the water, is this return, this kind of thing I think Tolkien's talking about for me personally. It's this return to this. There's just this wondrous sight where light across water. And before I've fully woken up and my very crotchety old mind has started to infuse all my other thoughts, I just have this moment of wonder, and it's just this beauty of light upon water. And I think that's the kind of thing that fantasy does in general, if it's done well.
So
that's recovery.
That's recovery. Let me take an offshoot question, because I like doing these sometimes, kind of exploring new things. In today's world, is there less recovery in the human being, the human soul, in the human experience than ever before? Or is there more, or is it the same? What do you think? Maybe because we have more stories than ever before that are accessible to people. But
yeah. I have a thought about that, but I'm curious what Dan thinks. Sorry, what Nad thinks. What do you think, Nad?
I think that human beings have always had the same problem of forgetfulness, but I think that especially now with modern technology and modernism, I guess the post Enlightenment, that we've kind of become chronological snobs, and we don't look back towards anything, and it's all about whatever's right here, right now, what's coming, push button generation type stuff. I think there's probably less recovery than in the past. I think that in the past there was more of an idea of tradition, more of an idea of we need to look back to what our ancestors said or thought, or telling stories. I think nowadays it's just, it's just checking out Netflix and, that's yeah.
Right. I agree. And I think, we have to keep in mind that when we say nowadays and when we're talking about our time, we're usually talking about first world problems, right? We're talking about a certain portion of the world. So
that's true.
For our portion of the world, though, I agree with that. And I think there's a sub portion of our society that goes even further into its decrepitude. It needs recovery even more, because there's a part of our society that does something different. It recognizes the dirtiness of the lens. It recognizes that everything looks drab and nothing seems new and fresh, and there's that we don't see beauty around us. We just see versions of the same old, and it glories in it. It points it out. It dwells in the darkness. It dwells in the dirt, in the foggy lens. It's kind of like, this is the way it is. The world sucks. And
do you have an example of what you mean?
So people that deconstruct things. So they talk about how did this come up? This came up recently, where it's unusual to find people. Let's say people that are that fight for the environment and preservation of natural spaces. Something which I think Tolkien would have agreed with the sentiment on. Preservation of forests, for example. Mm-hmm. Most of the people in the modern world who fight for the preservation of forests, you will never hear them talking about how beautiful the forest is. You will hear them talking about how ugly it is, what we do to the forest. You will hear they will spend all of their days focused on the ugliness and not on the beauty that they're supposedly is their raison d'etre. It's supposed to be the thing that drives them, that is the reason for being, is the environmentalists. But they never talk about how beautiful the forest is or the animals are. They never dwell upon the wonder of the stripes on the tiger. They instead talk about how terrible it is that we've killed off so many species in that same area. So they focus on the darkness and the drab instead of focusing on the beauty.
So why would you say then there isn't as much? Is it because this world, like Dan said, has taken over every aspect of our lives? For instance, I make a concerted effort not to read much news because there's so much of it everywhere all the time that I don't need all the bad news all the time, because it just overwhelms you, and you need even more recovery than you would otherwise. I mean, we hear about the worst things in the world at our fingertips all the time. And so, like, when I use Twitter, I have blocked a ton of accounts that I just don't want to see the news from. I'm like, I'm here not for the worst parts of humanity. And so I feel like not only is there less recovery in the sense that the wonder of that a good, as Tolkien would say, a good fairy story can bring you, the recovery that it makes you see. You get to see the sunset as an amalgam in your head, as an amalgamation of all the wonderful sunsets you've seen in your life, and re-experience that. But we need more recovery because we are in an even darker place mentally, I think, than like individually, not corporately, not as a society, but I think individually there's so much more darkness right now than there has been in, I don't know in how long, right? I'm not a psychologist. I can't look back and say I understand when things were the worst. I mean, obviously civilization has been a long history of destruction, disaster, and despair. But individually, I feel like there's so many, like kids in particular, when they get on, like when they're on TikTok all the time and when they're on social media all the time, man, it's dark for them. It's really dark. And they're reading less, so there's even less recovery. So we're in this sort of this spiral of like, there's the mountain is bigger because we need more recovery, and you're falling down this mountain, and then you're accelerating it by all the things that are but by you have no breaks anymore because the fairy stories aren't being read, they aren't being experienced, aren't being loved, and you're getting crap movies even. So even the recovery that you might have seen in a great film is no longer around. That's my little diatribe.
Right. That's brought home to me very powerfully in a show that I've watched some of right now, but I don't think I'm going to finish, which is Yellowstone. And, here's a show for which much of the grand appeal is the sweeping vistas and the beauty of the natural world. And every character in that show is reprehensible and unlikable. And with maybe one exception, but even then, not really. So there's we can't help ourselves. Even when we have the beauty of Montana and Wyoming on display in front of our eyes, we have to fill it with ugliness of human characters. And so I think we've grown to love the darkness in that regard. So we need more fairy stories. That's the point, is we need more real fantasy that gives our eyes that newness, that sparks the recovery, the clarity of vision.
Right. And so from that recovery, we need to escape.
Right.
From that darkness.
So in this section, the next concept is escape, that fairy stories bring escape. And he starts out by railing about people that criticize the idea of escape in literature. And he does it in a very Chestertonian way, actually, by pointing out that they use the word escape in a good way when it comes to something like if you're in a prison, you want to escape from a prison, and that's a good thing. But all of a sudden, when it comes to literature, if you're turning to literature for that kind of escape from a mental prison, now you're bad. Now what you're doing, say these overly critical literary types, now what you're doing is you're trying to escapism. Now it's a critique, and you're trying to deny the real world. And he goes on some very funny descriptions of how the real world is not that fun, and maybe wanting to escape. And he says they confuse the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. So if someone deserts something that they shouldn't have deserted, then that's recognized as a bad thing. And so essentially what Tolkien's doing here is an old philosophical thing, which is he's saying they use a word improperly. They use the word escape, and what they really mean is desertion. And that's not what we're doing, by the way. In fantasy, we're not deserting anything good.
Like you're escaping the real world of your responsibilities and your obligations and your duties. That's what they call escape.
Right. And they rightly criticize that, because it would be right to criticize somebody that just wanted to escape from their responsibilities. But he's saying they misuse it, because it turns out that the world, also he calls them Nazis. I just want to point out.
This is the first one.
He's the first one. Yep.
Right. During World War II, he called them Nazis.
Yeah, this is
no, 37. Didn't he start the
37, 39?
Yeah,
before.
So he revised his essay in 39. So maybe this is after the revision, because this is 39 is the I think it's after the technical start of World War II.
That's when he invaded Poland.
Poland. Yeah.
So
among other places.
But he didn't have to. It doesn't have to be that way. The sentence I'm thinking of is he says he's talking about the person who confuses the escape of the prisoner with the flight of the deserter. And he says, just so, in other words, in this way of speaking, a party, capital P party, spokesman might have labeled departure from the misery of the Führers or any other Reich, and even criticism of it as treachery. In other words, they're saying, you're trying to escape from the Third Reich. Yeah. You traitor.
Yeah.
And he, Tolkien is, he skewers. He's known for skewering the Nazis, actually, but I had forgotten about this reference before we read it.
It just occurred to me that this whole idea of escape, that escape is bad, that's exactly, to take a completely contemporary example, that is exactly what Rachel, the person playing Snow White, and the whole idea of like, oh, Snow White, it's so old, and we don't want this thing called love in it, and we don't like that. We've got to have representation, and we've got to have the strong female character and the effeminate, downtrodden male. Right? These are all the things that. So what they're doing is they're injecting this world consistently all the time into these fairy stories, and so escape is not even possible anymore. Because you're shackled within that world anyway, because it's just reminding you all the time of the world that we live in. And if fairy story does that, it's failed at the very beginning.
It makes you wonder about this modern movement that you're referencing, Jonathan. Oh, not Jonathan. Sorry, not an OJ.
Not an OJ. Today an OJ. I'm not an OJ.
So
okay.
I hope you're not an OJ every day, but it's a dangerous thing to be.
Just today, I'm not an OJ.
But makes you wonder, where does that instinct come from? Like, if the world is so bad to the people that promote this kind of thing, the world is so ugly, and there's all these things, why can't we escape it? Why do we have to keep re-injecting this bad world into everything that doesn't have the bad world in it? Like, why do we have to make Tolkien's work, for example, reflect the modern world?
Because it's not valid. I think they believe it's not valid unless it does, because their primary function are these modern sensibilities that they have.
Yeah, but so what they're saying is, I hate this modern world because of all the oppression that we have to go through. Also, any tale you tell me, I have to inject this hateful modern world into it.
Yeah, but I would say they're saying that the modern world that we're creating right now is better than this world, and so we're going to make They're playing John Lennon's Imagine in their head all the time, and they're imagining what this world should have been like when the author wrote it, if he would have been an ally, so to speak, of theirs.
It's like the modern world is a giant prison. So if the modern world is a prison, who are the prison guards?
Who are the wardens?
Who are the wardens? And it seems like all of the ideologies that you see that are going on, there's something. Getting spiritual here, but there's something demonic about it. It just seems like all of the modern pushes, all of the modern movement of ideas, it's to keep us in the prison. It seems like they don't want us getting out.
Yeah, it does seem a very dark impulse to say it at the same time. This world is terrible and dark and oppressive, and also, if you tell me another story that isn't like this, I'm gonna feel the need to inject this terrible, dark, ugly world into to somehow make it better or something dumb. Interesting because he shifts from that and goes from that kind of criticism to immediately start the takedown of the electric light.
This is my favorite. Like his example of the oppression of the modern world is weighing him down as he goes outside and he's like, look at all these mass-produced electric street lamps. These are awful. These are terrible.
What? This is why he hates Narnia so much.
Wait a minute. When did C.S. Lewis start writing? No, actually, it was after this. But
yeah, it was. Okay. I know.
So he goes outside and he sees a bunch of streetlights. He's like, I got to escape. I got to get out of here.
Actually, you know what's hilarious is given the chronology, C.S. Lewis would have heard this essay before writing about the lamp. So the lantern is actually trolling Tolkien. That's what it is.
That's right. He's trolling Tolkien the whole time. He's like, look, I'm going to write The Magician's Nephew now. I've written The Crown of the Blind Oaks.
And we know that Lewis trolls Tolkien because he deliberately trolled Tolkien with the space trilogy by making the main character based completely on Tolkien, obviously based on
and
Tolkien's
mentioning Numenor in That Hideous Strength.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, and that may not have ticked off Tolkien as much because he might have liked that kind of reference of like to an ancient time. It's something from the past. But anyway, it is fun, like you say, Dan, the fact that he says he calls the electric lamp a product of the robot age, capital R, capital A. So and then he brings back in
if only he knew.
He says these lamps may be excluded from the tale, that's the tale we ought to tell, simply because they are bad lamps. And it is possible that one of the lessons to be learned from the story is the realization of this fact. But then he goes into what Chesterton says, and he says, basically, Chesterton noticed that whenever someone says X and Y product have come to stay, or, you know, in American, the way we might talk about it, over the last few decades is, look, just deal with it. It's here. You're not going to get away from it.
You got to be on the right side of history.
Oh yeah, and that has
I know
further injection. Right. But yeah, I agree. And he talks about the march of science. But he talks about how Chesterton noticed that every time someone says this thing is here to stay, that thing eventually gets replaced.
It becomes obsolete and shabby.
Right. Yeah. Obsolete and shabby. That's right. So we get here a first-rate 2-paragraph rant by Tolkien against the industrial age and its products, which he then transitions smoothly into a takedown of what he sees as the industrial age taken to 11 in literature, which is science fiction. So we have on our podcast surmised that maybe some of the stories of science fiction might even might even be a kind of fairy story. Clearly, Tolkien would disagree with us here. Yeah. And interesting why he would disagree with us. He would disagree with us because of the products within those stories. What's found in those stories are products of technology in science fiction, which he sees as a kind of soulless thing that doesn't ever meet the standard of fantasy. It doesn't ever meet a standard of subcreation because the things that it uses have no magic about them, I think that's what he's actually.
As I was reading this, I started thinking about Star Trek versus Star Trek versus Star Wars.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. And people, rightly call Star Trek science fiction, but Star Wars is often called science fantasy because it's not the future of the Earth. It is a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It is a fairy story. In my opinion, it's truly a fairy story, not meant to be escapist, right? It follows. I think it follows a lot. It has magic. It has the things that we see. It has escape. I think there's a eucatastrophe in it, right? There's a lot of that stuff. And so I would have loved to know what Tolkien thought about Star Wars as a fairy story, because I think that alone, it makes it completely different. And so that's why when George Lucas made midichlorians be bacteria that gives you the Force, people were like, no, don't make it science. We don't want this science in Star Wars. That's not its place. That's not the story that we came to love. So anyway, yep. that's what I thought about when I read that.
He makes a really interesting comment when he's ranting about the streetlights. That people were probably telling him, just get over it, Tolkien. The street lamps are here to stay. You're not going to change anything. And he goes like, well, these will be gone soon at some point whenever they come up with something better. He's like, what'll never change? Lightning.
Yeah, I love that.
Going back to like the things that are always true, they're always real. And I think for him, that escape of fantasy is always going back to the simple things, the things that do not change, the things that are always there. I thought that was interesting. And he also talks about like some professor at a university who was all excited that the university was going to be close to the roads and the factories. and he was talking about, oh, you know, they're close to real life. You know, we're getting close to where all the hubbub is, you know, of life is going on. And Tolkien is like, you know, what's more real than a factory or, you know, a noisy car? He has nasty things to say about cars in this book too, but he goes like, you know, like I think he talks about like the roof of a train station being glass, and they're like talking about, oh, isn't this great? It's so wonderful. And he's like, well, it doesn't really compare to the dome of heaven. Like he's like, you know what's really great and it'll never change? Just looking up in the stars. Like,
right.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite quotes from this. And he says, for my part, I cannot convince myself that the roof of Bletchley Station is more real than the clouds. And as an artifact, I find it less inspiring than the legendary Dome of Heaven. The bridge to Platform 4 is to me less interesting than the Bifrost guarded by Heimdall with the Jalahorn. From the wildness of my heart, I cannot exclude the question. And this sentence I'm about to read, I thought was pretty cool because it made me think of something, a sub-genre of science fiction, which I think Tolkien may have had more of a liking to. And that's steampunk. So from the wildness of my heart, I cannot exclude the question whether railway engineers, if they had been brought up on more fantasy, might not have done better with all their abundant means than they commonly do. So it's common in one of the subgenres, steampunk, to have the metal and workings of the industrial world become something like to have trains that look like dragons, and you know, they, in fact, in a way, they are modern dragons. Tolkien would consider them worthy of fighting, just like a dragon's worthy of fighting, of opposing. And so the idea that you could be more creative with steel and metal, and then what the reality of the industrial world and its trappings produced in England, he might be a little bit less acerbic towards some of those varieties of or uses of the industrial age. Ultimately, I don't think he would have liked it, but he at least would have found that the railway engineers might have done something more, had done something more. So anyway, so that's the escapism, right? So, go ahead.
Well, yeah, the one line I had highlighted here is his definition of how there are more things profoundly to escape. After he rants about all this, though, he says there are more profound things to escape from than the noise, stench, ruthlessness, and extravagance of the internal combustion engine. There are hunger, thirst, poverty, pain, sorrow, injustice, death. And so even after he realizes, he goes through that, and I thought like, so this is an escape, but there's real escape too that's necessary, and Fairy Story can offer a little bit of that to those difficult things too. At least I think that's what he's saying.
Yes, and you're right. I misspoke because he calls science fiction escapist literature, because you're basically moving from the real world, not taking the technology of the real world and then moving beyond it, but you're taking the technology of the real world to such an nth degree that you act just as bad in that world, and it's not, and the things that world offers have no joy and beauty to them. They're just more mechanical, they're more unreal than the world. So that's escapist.
Speaking of that, it's sort of like the biggest unreal thing in Star Trek is that there's no more economy, there's no more poverty, there's no more violence. Everybody just happily is getting along now on Earth, and that's always been to me like, really?
All
Sure.
the people.
Thank you, Dan. Sing it, Dan.
Yeah. Did you catch this part of I think this is right next to what you just read, where he's ranting about zippers? Like he's talking about getting rid of like the Victorian clothing, and we'll have all this comfortable clothing that with zippers.
Zipper ties, he calls.
Yeah, zipper ties. Yeah. And he's talking about how and I think this is why he doesn't like science fiction. It's like it's this idea of taking technology to the nth degree, where it liberates us from all of the bad stuff we don't want to do, and then what becomes of humanity then? What will we do with all of this like leisure and free time? And he has a line in there where he talks about, even if you go to some other planet, now you're taking humanity and its technology with you. And what do you have? You still have greed. You still have violence. You still have, you have all these things that you haven't solved with all of your technology. It's like, now you just have fallen humanity that's more efficient now.
More efficient and noisier. So he has disparaging things to say with regard to escape about the airplane. He points out that one of the things that we try to escape is the limitations of the earth and our movement. So we seek to go have the perfect freedom of movement underwater and in the air, that what he calls the noiseless, gracious, economical flight of a bird. That longing which the airplane cheats, except in rare moments, seen high and by wind and distance noiseless, turning in the sun. That is precisely when imagined and not used. In other words, when you use an airplane, you realize it's noisy and it's a container you're sitting in, and it's noisy and ugly. But what it's trying to do is truly escape, is have that graceful, noiseless flight of the bird, the thing that is built to fly. And in a fairy story, you can have that. You can have real flight. You don't have to have flight in a tin can, a noisy tin can. So there's that, and then he goes on about a bunch of other things, like the talking of animals. How this is a deep desire on our part, and he seems to believe that the desire shows a lack. I mean, if you're a Christian, you believe, or Jew, you believe this because that there was a breaking at one point, because Adam in the garden talks to the animals. Yeah. He names them and they obey him by their names. And, understood is, he can understand them, they can understand him. And so Tolkien is saying that this yearning for the speech of animals is a sign that we had it once and it was lost, which was interesting.
But the greatest escape is the escape from death. We might yearn for animals, and we might have escape from loud combustion engines. And I think this informed, like that's just 2 pages before the end, but that's like that. Reading through the Silmarillion, that's like the central point of the whole thing almost, because that's what causes the downfall of men, is wanting to escape death, and they're unable to do it in their real world. And the elves can't escape life, so death to them is something that, like, they can't escape the specter of wanting death in a way that they can't ever achieve, or to not be confined by this world any longer.
It helps you get he here, before he makes it explicit in or more explicit in the Lord of the Rings, and after his death, his work in the Silmarillion is published. You can see here a window to how he thinks about elves and what they're eventually going to be like in his own world that he subcreates. Yeah. So yeah, it's kind of cool. That's one of the things I really like about On Fairy Stories, this whole essay, is that you can catch these glimpses through a window of his own world that he's crafting at this point, that we all know and we're familiar with from his work that's much publicized now. But back at this time, much of the references that we catch to the Lord of the Rings, anyone listening to this essay would have missed completely, because they're to them, like nowadays, people think when most people who are conversant with modern media think of what an elf is, they think of Legolas, but back in those days they didn't, and they would have had no idea what he was talking, except for the precious few that knew the medieval literature and what the history of the elfin court was, in the Fairy Queen and all that deep and long theme that Tolkien was speaking from. I like how he says, he finishes the section on death by saying, "Death is the theme that most inspired George MacDonald." That was kind of interesting. One of the throwaway lines. It'd be fun to go back and read some George MacDonald in light of Tolkien's opinions about him.
It's been a long time since I've read anything by MacDonald. Is that true? Do you think, have you read enough?
I don't know. I had forgotten that this line, I didn't register that this, even though I've read this essay a few times, I never thought about it in light of that. So it'd be interesting, because Yeah, there is a lot of elements of escape from death. I don't think we want to go into the details of what George MacDonald wrote right now, but that would be really interesting to see, to go back and see, is Tolkien right? Let's read a few stories from George MacDonald and see if he is indeed focused on the escape from death.
All right. That's recovery and escape, guys. I don't think we can move into consolation today. Consolation in the epilogue. I think we should give it a pause here, because I'm really stuck on this whole science fiction thing, because I love science fiction so much.
Me too.
I really do. So do you think Tolkien didn't like science fiction, or he didn't consider it the highest form of fantasy, or the highest form of a story, that a fairy story can be?
I actually think that Tolkien is mistaken about that, about science fiction. Here's why. I think Tolkien is actually reacting from his own...
Wait. Did you say he's wrong?
Yeah.
On our podcast, Exploring Tolkien?
I did. Sorry, guys.
I appreciate it.
Are you waiting? Dan's waiting for the lightning to come down. that most real of all elements of the world that no one can escape from is lightning. Yeah. So
you think Tolkien's wrong? He's incorrect in his assessment of science fiction.
I think probably a better way to say it is, I think that he's speaking from his own experience and his own great hatred of the abuses of technology. So in World War I and in the effects of the Industrial Revolution on the England that he loved, he saw the abuses of technology. But that actually doesn't mean that man's artificing nature can't actually bring some beauty. There are some things of technology that are created by man, of architecture and technology, that are not ugly. There are. I mean, some of the Christmas lights, for example. Like when you see Christmas lights, a Christmas tree is made more beautiful by Christmas lights done well. And that's and there's a reality to. I mean, we can use technology for good. And even for beauty, but I think Tolkien had experienced so much evil from technology that he had a very visceral reaction against it. So anyway,
I almost wonder if that being a product of his time too, that was kind of like the heyday of modernism, of this optimism that we're going to conquer the world, we're going to conquer space, we're going to have rockets, we're going to be going to the moon. I wonder if it
was a subduing of it all rather than an exploration of it all.
Right. And I wonder if that reaction on his part is just kind of a pumping of the brakes. Like, we don't need to be doing all that.
Yeah. And science fiction was really nascent right then, right? It was so early. There was the great science fiction authors. I mean, name a great science fiction author from before 1940. H.G. Wells.
Yeah. Wells. Asimov was writing.
Asimov. I don't think Asimov.
I got to look up. I know most of his work was in the 40s and 50s, but that would be interesting to look up. We prepared really well for this episode, guys.
I'll tell you, Isaac Asimov. His first short stories were written.
I thought they were the 30s, but
a lot of 50s, some 60s. No, I don't see anything earlier than the 50s.
I've lied to myself over these years.
Somebody's gonna. What about Arthur C. Clarke? Was he earlier than Asimov?
Oh no. Okay. No. He was after. What about Bradbury? Bradbury's after.
No, he was after. He was definitely the 40s and 50s.
What about Huxley? When did Huxley and Orwell write? They're later, of course, but I want to know
he wrote 1984 and 1948.
48? Okay, that's easy to remember. The reverse number. Yeah.
He flipped it.
Huxley 1950. No, that's a film edit. Right, bibliography. Here we go. The 20s was when he first.
There we go. I knew it.
Brave New World was 32.
Oh wow!
Exactly. So I caught Brave New World in his criticisms. I thought I caught it. So he talks about how in science fiction, the zipper ties, by the way, that's one of the aspects of the clothing of the people in Brave New World is that they're always taking off their clothes, and it's so easy to do because they can zip. So and he says that he says that their morality remains. What happens in the future? This of science fiction, we have the same amount of lust, we have the same amount of all these ugly sides of us, and hatred that we had before. So I should read the actual.
He makes some reference to having the zipper close so that they can get on fast toys, is what he says. Maybe that's from Brave New World. I'm not sure.
Here, shall I read it?
Yeah.
They may abandon the full Victorian panoply for loose garments with zip fasteners, but will use this freedom mainly, it would appear, in order to play with mechanical toys in the soon cloying game of moving at high speed.
Yep. And keep going.
And to judge by some of these tales, they will still be as lustful, vengeful, and greedy as ever, and the ideals of their idealists hardly reach farther than the splendid notion of building more towns of the same sort on other planets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's not Brave New World, but obviously it's the beginning of science fiction.
Yeah. Honestly, that's a very narrow view of science fiction too. Like science fiction at this point, like the kinds of science fiction stories we have, in my opinion, they're so distant into the future that they no longer resemble the world at all that we live in. Like you could say, sure, they've got screens, like they have windows now, but when you go to Dune, for instance, I feel like I'm sure you have war machines and things like that. Or if you go to what's the book? It happens like 30,000 years in the future. Can't remember his name, and I see the title in front of me. It's been a while. Anyway, it's so different from this world that it is barely recognizable in the same way that, like, look, they've got ships with screens and windows, just like in a fairy story. They still have houses with windows and doors. The similarities are stretched because they're so different.
Yeah, I mean, but Tolkien just doesn't like towns. He doesn't like clustered human dwellings.
That's a good point.
And so the idea that we would go colonize and we'd build more mechanical cities on other planets, it would be.
But what if you're going to those places to establish space away from other people?
Well, think about Tolkien's. I mean, I like your point, Jonathan. Sorry, not no, Jay. I like your point because I think about Tolkien's friend who wrote a story about another planet that is very much not about clustering towns. Paralandra is a very different kind of sci-fi book about another planet, and it doesn't have the clustered towns that Tolkien is complaining about.
But it's also, I think the distinction there is that it's not technological. It's spiritual, and these angelic beings show up and they transport them there, and it's just magic. It's not really.
It almost feels to me like C.S. Lewis is like saying, no, we can write science fiction without what you're talking about. I can do it. Look, here it is.
Yeah.
Again, the trolling version. Like it's almost like the space trilogy is a response to Tolkien. It is.
Yeah, it is.
Because we know that it was a contest between the two of them, or it was a bet that they did. That Tolkien lost.
They should have switched, man. Tolkien should have written the science fiction, and I would have loved to see what we would have gotten then. That would have been awesome.
Yep. Instead,
that's also why he didn't write the sequel to the Lord of the Rings, because it was so dark and it was just more, kids getting into dark places, and the world was just getting worse all the time, and it was getting more crowded, and there was more cities, and everything was just bad news.
Yeah.
So he decided to stop.
All the things he didn't like. All right. So we've gone over an hour, as is our wont.
Well, and we're still not done. We will do 6 full episodes on one essay by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is truly, guys, exploring Tolkien.
Consolation, the last concept that we're going to cover next time, is worthy of its own episode.
Yes, it is. It is. Consolation, and the epilogue ties right into that too. All right, guys. We're going to shut it down, but we will go to our members block that you can get by going to theonering.com/members, and that's all I'm going to say about that. But we'll be talking. I want to talk a lot more about this whole art thing, because look, the whole idea of escape that we talked about earlier, and that we need more escape now than ever before. We need more recovery now than ever before. And is that a reflection of the art around us right now? Anyway, we'll talk about that. So go to theonering.com/members to get that. You can join us in our Discord chat and ask the questions, because we're going to be giving a quote by Sigüenza, who has a great thought about Turin and the fantasy that Tolkien wrote. All right, guys, we're off. We're off to the members block.
Bye-bye, freeloaders.